Welcome everybody to the 2017 annual conference. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Mary Valentich. She has a social work career that spans over 50 years, and she has worked as a psychiatric social worker, a private practitioner, an author, a media commentator, a certified sex educator, and a diplomat of sex therapy, and as an activist. Committed to social justice, her special interests are human sexuality, feminism, in social work practice, and career management. Recently, she has been focused on medical assistance in dying, civic engagement, and climate change. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Mary Valentich.
Thank you very much, Heather. That's really great. And welcome everyone to the conference, and I'm so impressed to see all you early risers here. That's really something. It's a delight and an honor to speak to you. I did hesitate about doing this keynote because so many of you know me, and I thought, what can I offer? Someone suggested I just talk about sex, and that would be fine. However, the theme of this year's conference is lifespan of individuals and the profession. I do have the good fortune of having a fairly lengthy lifespan, so maybe that qualifies me. I will relate to this theme by reflecting on my own feminist social work journey of over 50 years, with particular reference to identity within the changing context of the profession. In doing so, I will present information on three social workers, three pioneers who have influenced me considerably. And the reason I'm going to be doing this is because this is not just about me, this is part of our legacy. I will also detail what I have learned about social change using examples of activism from my own career. My purpose in this keynote is to use my career as illustrative of the importance of identity, the role of social work heroes with respect to one's career, and the evolving nature of feminist social work practice. To engage effectively with you, I will ask you, sometimes individually, sometimes with your table mates, to consider and discuss a few questions that I hope will be meaningful for you. Now, why focus on identity? Because, essentially, it is central to an individual's development. All of you have studied what was known when I began teaching in 1968 as human growth and behavior, and later human behavior in the social environment. One framework for these courses was usually lifespan. Each phase, as we all know, of the lifespan has its particular tasks that individuals are expected to achieve. The formation of identity is fundamental to these phases, beginning with the assignment of identity sometimes prior to birth and continuing over a lifetime. By identity, I mean one's sense of oneself, your response to the question, how do I define myself? Who am I? We answer this question differently at various stages of our life. There are times in most people's lives when they experience uncertainty, doubts, and serious questions about their identity. For most of us, it remains a basic anchor, whether it's personal, professional, sexual, cultural, racial, ethnic, or religious. Identity is multifaceted and, in my view, just very fascinating. I love hearing how a person's identity has developed. We do not have to look very hard to consider the importance of identity. Think of the furor that happened just recently relating to well-known author Joseph Boyden and his claim, now somewhat modified, to Indigenous identity. Consider the infamous 60s scoop of Indigenous children and the loss, now finally acknowledged by Canada and the social work profession, of their cultural identities. Gender identity, thanks to LGBTQ persons and social movements to affirm their human rights, has become enormously complex relative to the way it was in the past, a simple two-feature male or female categories. A recent CBC series by Anthony Appiah, entitled Mistaken Identities, examined creed, culture, country, and he argued that broadening all of these factors offered hope for the world. So here's my first request of you. Using the cards, you'll see these index cards at your table. Take a few moments just to jot down the very first words that come to your mind when you think of your identity. And I won't be asking you to share this, so just if you can humor me. Any words that come to mind. Now, these words are likely indicative of basic features of your identity, I would argue. Our professional identity, how one defines oneself in relation to one's chosen profession of social work, gives one confidence, a sense of what is important, guidance in planning and decision-making, and overall a perspective for consideration of issues at all levels. Researchers, Yarman, McFall, Kohler, and Strom, have indicated that the development of identity is a process with its own stages. They highlighted the importance of social workers having a strong professional identity that includes leadership potential, a commitment to social change, and the ability to contribute to visibility and viability of the profession. More recently than 1997, social worker Ellen Fink-Samnick, writing in the Social Work Careers magazine, wrote about the challenge for social workers in working with populations affected by changing societal circumstances such as technology, new perspectives on end-of-life care, and refugee immigration issues. We social workers are expected to respond from clinical intervention across all those life stages to advocacy for social change. What keeps us going? She argues, and I'm quoting her, "A powerful force should motivate each social worker to pave the way for change, the strength of one's professional identity." For some social workers, including myself, there may be an overarching but rather deep-rooted identity, such as feminist. I recognize there are diverse feminist identities. In 2000, Baumgartner and Richards identified at least 17 prominent feminisms based on identity, and they hadn't even included First Nations and other indigenous people. So, in any form, whether it's African, Caribbean, Black feminist, in any form, identity provides a guide to much of our behavior and a sense of our direction. Because feminism has had, in my view, a major influence on social work, I'm going to ask you now to consider the place feminism has had in your own practice or life space and in relation to your professional identity. I wish to assure you I'm not trying to be prescriptive. There are feminists of every persuasion, from very conservative to liberal to radical, and some social workers may be inclined toward feminist perspectives, but not necessarily develop what they might refer to them to oneself as a feminist identity. So then that happens particularly if there's no well-established feminist practice context or role models. So there are many factors in your school space or your home space or workplaces that may affect your response to the question I'm going to ask. I'm going to put this question on the screen, and I'm going to ask you to respond to that question just off the top of your head and jot that on one of those cards that you see at your table. And later, I'm going to tally those up, or the wonderful volunteers are going to help tally it up, and we're going to post the results. So in your workplace, do you refer to yourself or present yourself as a feminist? From never, rarely, sometimes, often, always. And when you leave today, there will be boxes where you can drop off those cards. You don't have to put your name on them. Now, here's the typical response. The smaller numbers are usually at each end. That is, a minority of social workers say they always call themselves feminist. A larger group say they never or rarely identify as feminists. The majority fall somewhere in between, the sometimes and often categories, in other words, the usual bell curve. These responses are similar to those found over the years in strikingly different work settings. When I have explored the negative responses with students, I have heard very familiar comments. My mother was a feminist, but I'm not. I don't identify with bra burning. We still hear this. But even more loaded is the one, I don't hate men. Feminists are too angry, or it would not be accepted in my workplace where the medical model is very strong. For a few minutes, and I know it's always hard to bring a group back, but please discuss with your colleagues at the table any of your reactions to just answering that question. Any thoughts or feelings? Was it easy, hard, relevant, irrelevant? So just take a few moments at your table to just talk about what it's like to answer that question. I'll give you one more minute. It's always a risk, I know, to be interactive, and you're a great group. Okay, I hope that gives you some flavor of what it means to consider questions of identity. They're very personal questions, and I realize that it's hard sometimes to get into some of those questions, but I do want this to be a presentation that does connect with who you are and what is important to you, and that's why I've asked you those questions. I'm now going to elaborate on my own feminist journey and the development of my feminist identity. My experiences may resonate with some of your own interest or situation, or they may not, and that's perfectly fine. I recognize that having primarily an academic career in a small private practice and being a white, educated woman has given me some privileges and freedom from certain constraints. Each person's journey is unique. My story may have some historical interest, and possibly all our stories will foster a sense of connection among us so that we can work harder and in a more concerted fashion on common social goals. So let's start with, of course, growing up. That's what we all have had the good opportunity to do. My own sense of identity as a little girl evolved within the context of a small Croatian community in Cooksville, Ontario. I don't have a pointer to show you where my dad was in that picture. It was about 1939. I think he's in the back somewhere there. As you can see, with many immigrant populations, more men in particular groups came than women. And I thought, I'm not in that picture. It's about 1939. My mother came in just before the war started in 1939. My mom and dad did not know. Oh, my mother said she had seen my dad once. He was about 15 years older than she was. It was an arranged marriage. And she was very brave, I think, to head out of Europe at that time. There were many women, many trainloads of women actually leaving so that they would escape before the war really broke open. Now, as a child, born to immigrant parents, one thing I was always aware of were the Inglesi. Those were people that were out there somewhere, people whom we didn't know all that well, but they were friendly, and I certainly had a great time. That was a rented home. It was actually a boarding house because that's how women earned their keep, by running boarding houses. And so I had the privilege of actually growing up with a large group in the home, and as the little girl in the family, I was fairly favored, and it was a great growing up experience. As a child under 4, I was welcomed everywhere and taken wherever my parents went. An early memory relates to going to a meeting where people always spoke in a very animated fashion. And this has some bearing on the later activity of mine. I recall a funeral that was in a home of one of those Croatian families. And I can remember as a child under 4 standing on that kneeler and being very curious about who that person was. He had visited us very recently. I learned much later in life, when I was conducting a research study on this early Croatian community, that as a young child, apparently I occasionally made statements deemed outrageous by others. And shocking, yes. I suffered no penalty, and that's the thing. My parents were obviously very forgiving and loving, and neither did members of the Croatian community. By age 5, we'd moved to Burlington, Ontario. And over the years, one very prominent impression I had was that my father, as a laborer, was in a really subservient position, and it bothered me that he was always subject to the employer's rules. I sensed his powerlessness, and it angered me. I also wanted to mention my mother. If you think of social work as beginning with friendly visiting, she was really supreme in this regard. And over the years, we went to many hospitals to see usually friends. We didn't really have family in Canada, but we would often visit people who were ill, and she was just a model of being a kind person who could listen to people, and that was very important to me. Over time, though, I determined that I would excel because that powerlessness that my father experienced did distress me. And I found my roots through education and sports. In elementary and high school, I was a good student, engaged in drama, public speaking, sports, obviously, student clubs. I was heading for normal school. Those of you who are too young to know, that was teachers' college, until my principal recommended applying for university, and I thank him forever. I graduated from McMaster University in Hamilton in 1963 in honors sociology. I had an intense desire to understand the cultures and systems within which people lived, as well as individual functioning. Several times in the early 1960s, I drove to the Six Nations Mohawk Reserve near Brantford, Ontario. I was writing a paper, I recall, in the social anthropology class, but I wanted to come closer to a reality that I found difficult to understand. Who were these people who at that time we called Indians, who were living separately, subject to prejudicial attitudes and discrimination? That was hard for me to understand because I knew Canada to be a land of opportunity. And their reality, as far as I could understand, just didn't seem to make sense to me. Nor did the teachings of a major institution, the Catholic Church. By my undergraduate days, I recognized what I saw as the Church's misogyny in denying women birth control, but punishing them for becoming pregnant or even daring to think of themselves as sexual beings. And I rapidly fell away from practicing as a Catholic. Through part-time jobs in a hardware store and summer employment in day camp, I realized that I enjoyed working directly with people, and I chose social work to the chagrin of my sociology professors. I graduated. I went to University of Ottawa, St. Patrick's School of Social Welfare, and I graduated in 1965, having 6-month field placements in Potsdam and Rochester, New York. One of the big disappointments was that I didn't get to New York City. I had hoped I'd have a placement there, because in grade 11, I had gone to New York, and I was convinced I'd be living in Greenwich Village and generally leading an exciting life. However, that's okay. My first choice had been Columbia, but Columbia wanted me to be supervised by a MSW social worker, and then I might qualify for a scholarship. And I could only find work as a social work case aide in Hamilton General Hospital with supervision by a social worker who had an old-time BSW. We actually had old-time ones, and then they disappeared for quite a while. It was a super first social work experience for me. And after graduating with my MSW, I traveled for 5 months in Europe. It only cost $500 for those 5 months. Back in Toronto, there were jobs aplenty for social workers. And my travel mate and I went to job interviews for 2 months because we had fun doing them. And finally, I chose Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, starting in 1965. It was challenging to work with families and patients with complex mental states. In my second year at that hospital, I teamed up with colleagues to start the first behavioral unit for adolescents in a psychiatric hospital in Canada. At that point, I certainly identified as a social worker, but the question of feminism hadn't really come to the fore. Given the problems experienced by the patients, women and adolescent girls, one might think that I'd begun to see myself that way, but I didn't. While St. Patrick's was named the School of Social Welfare, a name that suggested a broad perspective, the curriculum really didn't address social issues that might precipitate some of the problems that were bringing women into mental hospitals or leading adolescents to engage in self-destructive behavior. Social work had not yet picked up on what radical sociologist C. Wright Mill's idea that private troubles might stem from public issues. In the early 1960s, social work education and practice were, in my view, feminist-free zones. Under the guise of helping, psychiatric treatment had just very recently concluded with water baths. I did see one ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, and I knew about one person in our unit who had had a lobotomy. No one suggested that some women might be dealing with violence from partners or that adolescents might be running away from sexual abuse. Helping professionals didn't know about domestic violence or sexual abuse. We didn't even have language that would refer to those phenomena that likely were very prevalent. How could we be so blind? We needed consciousness-raising groups, but the second wave of feminism, women's liberation, was only in its beginning phase in the mid-1960s in Canada. In social work education, from the 1940s onward, psychoanalytic, or psychodynamic theory dominated much of social work theory, curricula, and practice. That kind of theory did not recognize women's marginalization and the lack of power that women had within institutions such as the family, church, education, or politics. Patriarchy ruled. Traditional norms about the roles of men and women were firmly in place. Few people raised questions about equality. Phyllis Chesler's book, Women and Madness, had yet to be written, and it wasn't published until 1972. In 1968, out of the blue, I was asked to join the faculty at St. Patrick's School of Social Welfare at the University of Ottawa. I leapt at the chance. For a 27-year-old who had never really given up the idea of teaching, it was a wonderful opportunity. And one of the reasons I was hired was because I had the sociology background, and the director of the program thought that I and some other new faculty might bring more current perspectives to the program. This director played a very significant role in my identity development, and I'm going to call him my first social work hero. Now, what do I mean by hero? I thought that picture would give you the best idea of what we mean by heroes, at least what I do. Someone who stands out for their remarkable qualities. What makes them your hero? They recognize you and your potential. Now, those of you, not everyone in Canada plays hockey or knows about hockey. That's Gordie Howe and Wayne Gretzky. And you can see, yeah, isn't that something to think that Gretzky was then and there ready to acknowledge who was his hero, and that obviously Gordie Howe responded to him. So the hero may be known and celebrated, or very much a personal hero unknown to the wider world. This morning when I was driving here, there was a section on heroes, and I thought, great, I'm not off base. They're talking about it on CBC. And it was a man who is being decorated for his activities as a bomber during the Second World War. And he made the very important point. He said, I'm not the hero. It was the guys in the mud who were the heroes. And I thought to myself, that applies to social work. I can be up here in the podium, but it's you people out there who are working hard every day, facing all kinds of crises. You're the heroes. Now, what I'd like you to do is think back when you were choosing social work as your profession. Can you identify one of your heroes, someone who took an interest in you and promoted your career? And I'm a strong believer in writing things down. There's good research backing for that. You know, again, off the top of your head, would you jot that person's name on the card, someone who influenced you? And then, once you've got that, talk for a few minutes with the people at your table about your social work hero or heroes. Oh. I'll give you 1 more minute. That's really great. I love hearing the buzz of conversation, and that's when I need to interrupt you again. Okay, I can see that there are definitely heroes whom you have been talking about, and I'm hoping that you're willing to give the group some general feedback by just simply raising your hand, and it's perfectly okay to be in any particular category. For example, how many could not think of a hero? Any hands? Okay, there are some hands. I definitely see some hands. How many, if you were able to think of a hero, it was a family member? Quite a few there. A friend? Not so many. A teacher? I would expect a lot of hands might go up. A social worker? Quite a few there. That's really interesting. A celebrity? Come on, folks. All right. Nobody remembers George C. Scott on the program as a social worker, right? Okay, this time, if you don't mind leaving those cards with the name on it in those boxes as you exit, I'm going to be posting the names of your heroes if you wish, and later you can also put up other names. I think that's important so that we can honor all of them. And I'm going to tell you now about my first social work hero. I doubt that anyone will recognize this young man, born in England, 1920-something. He was in his 20s when he arrived in Canada in 1932, in the midst of the Depression era, with other young jobless men. He was on his own. What did he do? He rode the rails to the Canadian West. He lived and worked for 2 years as a cowboy on a ranch near Three Hills, Alberta. He's fondly remembered by one family and friends who knew him to be an unusual person, bright, charming, and willing to work with his hands. Does anyone recognize this person? Aha, I see a few hands waving. I can't see too well to the back, but that's great. This cowboy, or wannabe cowboy, knew he had other destinies. Despite sparking the interests of a fair number of women, I would say, because they phoned us, he decides to join the Oblate Order of Priests. He obtains his undergraduate degree, and by the late 1940s, he's serving as an assistant pastor in a Catholic church in Ottawa. Now, this picture should look a little more familiar to a number of you. In 1945, the head of the Oblates orders Father Swithin Bowers, formerly known in the young picture as Frank Bowers, to prepare himself academically to develop a school of social welfare at the University of Ottawa. Father Bowers heads off to the New York School of Social Work at Columbia University, where he enters a fast-track 18-month master's program. So he goes in 1945, but in January 1949, he's ordered to come back to Ottawa and initiate the social work school. From January to June, that's only 6 months, Bowers gets the program accepted by the Senate of the University of Ottawa, sets up field placements in Quebec, Ontario, and the Eastern Seaboard of the United States, recruits faculty, and enrolls 17 students. That same year, 1949, based on his thesis, this is the same year, This relative newcomer to social work publishes a 3-part article in the prestigious journal Social Casework, and it's entitled The Nature and Definition of Social Casework. And I'm going to put the definition up on the screen for you. I will tell you, and I've looked at his articles in preparation here, he does a wonderful analysis of all the existing literature that was available to him. The various authors he cites bemoan the lack of a professional definition of what is social work. And after he does his very thoughtful, careful analysis, he comes up with this definition. And this is social casework, is an art in which knowledge of the science of human relations and skill in relationship are used to mobilize capacities in the individual and resources in the community appropriate for better adjustment between the client and all or any part of his total environment. Let you take that in for a bit. And remember, it's social casework. And there were other perspectives, but he was focusing on what was very prominent in social work at the time. And you today would not necessarily agree with that particular definition. There were other perspectives, even in 1949. But I can assure you that for nearly 2 decades, 49, 59, 69, this becomes the most widely accepted portrayal of social casework. And he really focused on the powerful nature of the social work relationship. And that's what it meant very much to be a social worker, was that you had this capacity for relationship which you could mobilize. It was both an art and a science. And that became, as I said, so widely accepted that that was what was known as social work. And other ways of functioning were given less attention. The school itself grew, and within a few years earned a reputation as the premier casework school in Canada. And I'm using the term casework because the term clinical had not yet come into vogue. Father Bowers was my professor when I was in the program, and later he was my boss. This man was an incredible hero to many, a magnificent orator, a most engaging teacher, and a thinker who challenged each of us to question all and any truths. I was thrilled to join the St. Pat's faculty and began by teaching human growth and behavior. In my second year, I was assigned the course on abnormal psychology, previously taught by a psychiatrist, and he had, not surprisingly, employed a medical model. Father Bowers asked me to introduce content into that course that addressed those role changes, evident to him but not yet within the curriculum, and frankly, I didn't really know what he meant. But I immersed myself in the emerging literature by Betty Friedan, Germaine Greer, and Robin Morgan, feminist literature. And here's an excerpt, just a very brief one, from a lecture that I gave in 1971. Quote, "An examination of the political, financial, and occupational sectors of Canadian society reveals that we adhere fairly rigidly to traditional ideas about male and female capacities. In politics, men make the policies and women make sandwiches. Few women reach the top of the ladder in the business world, and in the labor force, women are relegated to female jobs and occupations where generally they're paid much less than men. Movement toward greater equality in the labor force has been minimal, not only because men have been unwilling to give up power, but because men and women, women's liberation notwithstanding, have been sold a psychological bill of goods by Freud and followers who preached anatomy as destiny, women are passive, men active, and women filled with penis envy and masochism can only fulfill themselves through being wives and mothers." So it wasn't until Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, did our traditional ideas about women's real role begin to crumble. The response of the students was electric. I had touched a chord. With respect to my own identity, I realized, at that point, I am a feminist. I believed in the equality of women and men and was prepared to engage in actions to affect change in the traditional norms that were so prominent that no longer suited women or men and indeed oppressed both genders. Now let me complete Swithin's story. The school was transferred to Carleton University in 1972. By this time, Swithin, not surprisingly, had left the priesthood and he married Margie Moores, who was one of my MSW social work classmates. They moved to Portugal in the late 1970s and returned in 1992 to visit Calgary. On the third day, we traveled to Three Hills, Alberta to see his friends and former home. Upon our return on that day, we got home at 9 o'clock, he suffered a stroke. and he died in Foothills Hospital 11 days later on July 13th. He was 84. So that was quite an experience, but he came full circle with that, I think. This is where he'd started, and this is where he died. Now, the period of the late 1960s and 70s was an era of social ferment. In the United States, there had been protests against the war in Vietnam. African Americans were seeking full citizenship. Students were wanting their rights recognized. The sexual revolution was occurring with greater freedom, especially for women. Around the world, women were expressing their determination to take charge of their reproductive rights, their sexual expression, and generally their lives. Social work was not immune to these changes. Joel Fisher's 1973 article, Has Mighty Casework Struck Out?, had a devastating impact on the profession. Psychodynamic theory began to give way to cognitive behavioral approaches. The profession became increasingly research-oriented and accountable. Techniques like goal attainment scaling, single system design to assess one's practice came into vogue. The social worker as scientist practitioner began to emerge, and we increasingly focused on social structural features of the society. Now, but before we leave the 1970s, I'll introduce my second hero, and he will be no surprise to many of you, and that's a picture of Jim Gripton. He and I met in 1968 as new faculty members at St. Patrick's School of Social Welfare. We became partners in 1973 when we moved to Denver, where I studied for my doctorate. It wasn't all study, as you can see. Jim was an incredibly innovative and creative person with wide-ranging interests in clinical practice, research, policy development, education, and activism. He fostered the introduction of computers into social work education and practice, promoted doctoral studies in social work, advocated against the oppression of various groups, helped develop private practice, not just in Alberta, but Canada, and initiated novel policy ventures such as a focus on provincial welfare policies. Underlying his social work activities was a commitment to social justice and in particular to feminist perspectives. I'm only going to mention two of his particular contributions, and they both were ones that involved a fair bit of conflict. But the controversies of the 1970s resulted in important changes in social work education and practice. In the St. Patrick's School, and I'll use that as an example, there was considerable opposition to his emphasis on a research base for social work interventions, and even to his teaching social policy through community practice projects. He was demonstrating how individuals' issues arise in context of poverty and addiction, but that wasn't really in the mode that was evident then. But it was another initiative that was particularly opposed, namely Jim and my proposal for the first elective in the school's program since 1949, namely a human sexuality course. Now today you may consider such content as perfectly appropriate, but in 1971, sexuality was really a taboo topic, and it took us 2 years to introduce this course into the curriculum. And that episode, that battle, revealed to me that change was so incredibly threatening to some persons. Because we feared retribution, and with permission of the students, we videotaped all sessions of the first 10-week elective course. And I'm going to take you right back to 1973, because this is the intro, it's a short clip from the course. All his adult life, Jim worked to end sexual oppression by societal institutions representative of a sexually repressive society. A major achievement was the introduction of an elective human sexuality course in the St. Patrick's School of Social Welfare curriculum at Carleton University in 1973. This was the first program elective since the school's inception in 1949, and one of the 3 earliest social work courses in human sexuality in Canada. After 2 years of opposition, the course was finally offered. It was a radical venture with its sexually explicit films smuggled in from the US, its non-pathological approach to sexual orientation, its feminist perspective and critique of traditional sex roles, a male-female teaching team, namely Jim and I, and an emphasis on self-awareness and communication through small group exercises. The course was a success with students. With publication of an early article in 1975, the course became a model for teaching human sexuality. Because of concern for our reputations and possible retribution, and with the students' permission, we videotaped all sessions.
This was the first course in human sexuality offered to our students. Those of you planning the introduction of such a course should anticipate certain kinds of opposition. For example, university authorities are likely to react negatively because sex still is a controversial subject. It is not yet considered as meeting the criteria for an academic course, and it is still viewed as belonging to medical rather than social work education.
This was an optional course offered to students in the final semester of the master's program. We alerted them that participation would be an intensive experience. We limited the number to 10 and selected randomly 5 men and 5 women from the 19 students who signed up. We believe that a course such as ours should be offered initially as an option. We are also convinced that the only effective way of teaching it is in the small group. It is also important that students be aware of the special demands and requirements of such a course before choosing it.
Over the next 30 years, we introduced the course at the University of Denver and promoted our experiential style of teaching human sexuality. At the University of Calgary, we initiated several other sexuality courses for social work undergraduate and master's level students. We offered workshops in Canada and beyond, thereby helping to establish human sexuality as legitimate social work content and a practice specialization. Jim and I were among the earliest, and in Canada the only, social workers to gain our certifications from ACSW as sexuality educators in 1976, sex counselors in 1979, and therapists in 1980. We had fun with this topic. Yes, everything isn't grim. It's a great area to teach in. And we'll move on from Masters and Johnson there. I'm very pleased that a 1985 book that we wrote at that time, Feminist Perspectives on Social Work and Human Sexuality, was reissued last year by Rutledge. It was a Rutledge revival, Feminist Perspectives on Social Work and Human Sexuality, so you can look at that later. It was great to have it come out again. Now, Jim Gripton's other significant contribution relates to his groundbreaking study of a newly discovered phenomena in social work. In his 1974 article, I'm just going to go back away from that one, the article was entitled Sexism in Social Work, Male Takeover of a Female Profession. Gripton showed that despite having comparable qualifications, men tended to have higher salaries than women, to proceed more quickly up their career ladders, and to more often be found in senior, more powerful positions. This was true both in education and practice realms. He attributed the disparity in the treatment of women to sexism, and sexism had been around as a concept, but it really wasn't prominent in social work. He defined it as a higher value being assigned to male social workers despite their having equivalent credentials, and indeed was challenged by one of the journals for where did he come up with this definition. It was an early phase. It's fair to say that that study blew the lid off social work's complacency about its own discriminatory practices. And I will mention that his article didn't initially get accepted in social work because they said that's Canadian data, it's not that important, which shows you where we stood in relation to the US. But it was nice to see that later, when the US began doing its own studies on this issue, they cited Jim's pioneering work. His research influenced my own doctoral research. In 1975, I completed a survey of what we called sex differences in career management of social workers. Like Jim, I was very interested in the varying experiences of men and women in social work. A gender lens, here referred to as sex differences, was just beginning to emerge in the mid-1970s in social work research. The concept of career management was one I coined, and I've been able to use it successfully in work that Jim and I did later with respect to career planning and acting assertively at work. And I just bring out this book, Acting Assertively at Work, because I think it's still a very handy book that addresses issues that we're dealing with here and now. It is out there in the booksellers area. After completing my doctorate, I returned to Ottawa in 1975. A significant experience there really confirmed my identity as a feminist practitioner. I was approached by a sociology student, Sue Nelson. She believed that women who had been raped needed special attention that wasn't available in social service agencies. And I'm using the term rape because the term sexual assault wasn't yet it wasn't used. She, Dr. Martin Gillison, a physician, and I initiated Ottawa's first rape crisis center in 1975. When Jim and I moved to Calgary in 1976, I shared the model of the Ottawa Community Agency with a collective of women here in Calgary who had a similar mission. The Ottawa model was accepted at that first meeting that I attended, and we initiated Calgary's first rape crisis center in 1976, and I was involved until 1984. That center offered services to victims, later known as survivors, advocated for legal changes such as promoting sexual assault legislation where we differentiated the kinds of assaults that might occur. We organized Take Back the Night marches and generally worked to end sexual violence against women and to promote equality. So we had tried to have a broad focus. Our first social work, our first director at the agency was somebody some of you know well because she's the director at the University of Calgary's Student Wellness Center, and that's Debbie Bruckner. Now, in my scholarly writing, I've identified the emergence of feminist perspectives in social work in the 1970s as the beginning phase. Feminist social work practice came to the forefront of the profession, I think, in Canada under the leadership of a number of people, but one of them is Helen Levine, and I do want to mention her name. Jim Gripton, when he was at Carleton, had managed to get her hired as a sessional lecturer, and she really took the lead. Carleton was working on its structural approach at that time, and Helen's feminist approach and Maurice Moreau's structural approach really worked together very well. And in due course, Carleton really became known as Canada's feminist school. And what I'm going to show you here is a picture of Jim and Helen at St. Patrick's 50th celebration. If we see the 70s as the beginning phase, I'd say the 80s were the building phase. In this period, feminist social work practice gained prominence in most programs. Practitioners received support from feminist perspectives because they embraced activism as well as what we call direct services. The relationship between a client and a social worker became one with less distance and a greater sense of equality. Hierarchy was considered oppressive, whether it was in a client relationship or in the organization itself. Pathologizing and labeling was out. The personal as the political became a standard way of thinking about women's situation. At U of C, I introduced the first feminist social work practice course at the university in the master's program, and authored in 1976 my first review of feminist social work theory and practice in Frank Turner's theory books. Review chapters followed in 1996 and 2010, and if I had more time, I'd comment on Frank Turner's contribution to social work knowledge. Those reviews were extremely beneficial in terms of my own career because they gave me some international recognition. But there were occasions in the 80s and 90s when I did keep my feminist profile a bit low. And that was largely because in some feminist circles, professionals weren't trusted. And so you had to walk delicately in some circles. Nonetheless, feminist perspectives enabled Jim and me to engage openly in activist causes such as opposing discrimination against gays, arguing against a biologically based narrow definitions of the family, which still come to the fore. In the mid-1980s, when I was chairperson of the Board of Accreditation of the Canadian Association of Schools of Social Work, Jane Aronson and I included criteria related to knowledge about women into the guidelines used to accredit social work programs. A few years later, when Nere Saint-Amand and I were co-chairs, we encouraged Carol Christensen and others in revising accreditation standards to address racism. Regrettably, we still have lots of, if not lots, we still have issues relating to racism and discrimination within programs. Another key issue in the 80s and 90s, and even currently, as we know in the US, relates to reproductive rights. For many feminists, freedom to make choices about one's body is seen as absolutely fundamental. As recently as the Women's March on Washington in January of this year, I heard a feminist declare, on CBC that without commitment to reproductive rights, one could not call oneself a feminist. Now, I don't believe personally that anyone has a right to tell anyone else what they can or can't call themselves, but I do think that that's important to consider this question of reproductive rights. And I'm very aware that there are people who call themselves, who identify as conservative feminists, who support the pro-life movement. However, for me personally, freedom for women to make their own choices about their reproductive rights is very central to my identity. And I think it was very much a part of our teaching, and we were very upfront about it always. Here's a clip of a role play that we devised in the late 1980s for teaching our sexuality students.
As a feminist practitioner, women's issues and women's right to choice were in the forefront of his clinical practice. In a 1986 teaching role-play video, Jim, as therapist, asserts women's rights to reproductive choice.
I am so upset. I just don't know what to do. Ever since I became pregnant, I've just gone crazy almost. I know I can't take care of another child, and I want to have an abortion. But my husband, well, he really wants this baby, and I don't know what to do.
You're having a lot of difficulty making this decision, Mary, and you're trying to take Bill's wishes into consideration. But it is important for you to understand that as far as women's bodies and their reproduction are concerned, decisions about these are for women to make themselves.
My point in showing this particular clip was simply to ask the question of yourself, one that we can't discuss here because it would take too long, but just to ask, what are the fundamental beliefs that each one of you holds? Because that makes up your core professional identity. It's an important question for each of us to consider, and it may change over your lifespan. And who provides you with support for the beliefs that you have? Not everyone is as fortunate as I have been to have had the support that Jim and I have given to each other over time. That's been really important. It's also critical, I think, if you don't have that kind of support in your home territory, to find a group of like-minded colleagues. And in Calgary, we've had the good fortune, for example, to develop Calgary Social Workers for Social Justice. And I know other settings around the province also have groups of people who can get together and who can find support for what they believe. Now, I must mention one central event that really affirmed the place of feminist practice within social work, namely the December 6, 1989 slaying of 14 women at École Polytechnique in Quebec because they were feminists. This horrific act shocked Canadian society, not unlike the recent murders of Muslims in the mosque in Quebec. People realized that misogyny was a force to be addressed. The murder of these women strengthened many of us to work harder on changing what we then called the chilly climate in universities and also in the workplace. We worked hard, for example, on eliminating sexist language. That was a big issue, and it still remains. There was also a lot of work being done by feminists in Canada on promoting gun control. With colleagues in the Women's Centre at the University of Calgary, I helped develop the December 6th Memorial, which reminds us every year that women and children still face violence. By the early 1990s, as the second advisor to the president of the University of Calgary on women's issues, I developed another feature. It had always been there, but it became even more prominent, and that was as a commentator on women's issues. I did so because I believe the media are a powerful instrument for effecting social change. Now, from my perspective, the 1990s were the heyday of feminist approaches in social work, and feminist ideas were increasingly interwoven into all aspects of our practice. We were able to focus on racism, diversity, inclusiveness, and in general, the pursuit of social justice. Basic idea was that women could not be free until all other oppressed individuals and groups were free. And often students will come to me and say, how do you link your feminism to social justice issues? Well, it's all together. If there's one group that's oppressed, then others are not actually free to live to their potential. It was during this period also that the role of feminist men in social work came to the fore. I never excluded men from action to promote equity. But I recognized the risks of their taking a prominent role, and I developed what I called a gender-sensitive approach to practice, one that enabled social work to have a theoretical understanding of both men and women and male and female social workers. In the 1990s, though, a backlash against feminism occurred in the wider society. We heard then, and you still hear now, feminism is dead, or that it was unnecessary. We've all achieved our goals. There were ongoing rifts that you find in any social movement that were becoming prominent. Feminism was starting to be seen as a movement dominated by white women and their concerns, and many women of color and some younger women felt excluded. So that was a difficult period. Post-structuralism and postmodernism, two related philosophies, began to emerge in social work in the 90s. All rational explanations and truths were to be challenged. Deconstruction of texts in terms of their assumptions and contradictions became a strategy. It was a bit of an uneasy time in feminism. The concept of intersectionality had been around for a while, but it surfaced and illuminated the complexity of factors: race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, class, gender, all of these that result in oppression. It's overwhelming to consider all these factors, but they are important. In my view, the period of the 2000s emerges as the maturing of feminist practice. I'm going to identify one more hero, and I'm glad that she is a woman. Some of you will know her as your dedicated professor. Her support of students was legendary. Her readiness to engage with social issues, her communication skills, and her astute analyses of situations still inspire me. Gail Gilchrist James was born in a rural area outside of Edmonton in 1940. She graduated with her MSW in University of Toronto in 1966, and as it happened, Jim Gripton happened to be her advisor. She started her social work career in Edmonton, working with children in the school system, and joined the faculty in Edmonton in 1975, and moved to Calgary in 1994, retiring as an associate professor emerita in 2004. She died of lymphoma in 2008 at 68. While working with students with learning disabilities and their families, she developed a passion for public issues that led to a lifelong involvement in social advocacy and public policy. Provincially, nationally, and internationally, she held many, many positions, and you'll see some of them up on the screen. Her international leadership began in 1978. She was instrumental in hosting the first World Social Work Conference in 1984 in Canada, and the establishment of the International Federation of Social Workers Human Rights Commission in 1988 to advocate for missing, wrongfully detained, and tortured social work students and workers. She was the first president that came from Canada in 1988 and appointed by the Prime Minister to chair the National Council of Welfare. I highlight Gail's international work as she was a front runner in this regard. I'll never forget a conference in Stockholm that just rose as one person when she walked on the stage. Currently, feminism in its numerous varieties, or third wave, and I hear there's even a fourth wave, I'm not quite up on that one, but feminism as it exists now in the 2000s is very strongly invested in policy issues and connections with women around the world. This is a very dominant feature, and it's very congruent with social work's international reach. We are not strangers to issues of sexual violence against women in war, sex trafficking, genital mutilation, and the devastating effects of poverty and escape from war-torn countries. Social media has fostered our connections enormously. As a commentator on Canadian social policy, Gail wowed Rex Murphy, if you remember him on CBC's Cross Country Checkup. She had very incisive comments, and I remember he couldn't stop referring to that caller named Gail. In her final years, unfazed by her illness, she devoted countless hours of volunteer expert witness testimony to help victims of eugenic sterilizations in Alberta win a landmark class action suit. Here's a clip from an interview I did with her a few months before her death in May 2008.
The other thing I wonder about, I know you have a strong interest in clinical because we've had many discussions around clinical and health-oriented issues. On the other hand, so much of your career has been involved in policy, policy development, the international component in social work education. Have you ever felt torn among all these?
No, No, I haven't really, because the old line about the personal is the political is really true. And in social work, one reason I love social work is there is a continuum that allows you to look at how all the pieces impinge on one another, and how you can't just pick a piece of policy without having some idea of how it's going to affect real live walking around human beings. But you also, not to exaggerate, you ought not to have people in therapy for the pain in their lives that was caused by bad public policy. I mean, that's called blame the victim in other circles. So to me, it has always been the dynamic continuum and the belief that you have to have some idea of the big picture, because only then do you understand your role in it. And that's how you don't get burned out. It's when you're working away in your little cave by yourself and you think you're the only one in the world who's doing this, that you wind up taking the rest cure in 3 years. But if you see that your little bit is helping something else somewhat more grand, hopefully, then you don't ever get lost.
Okay, is that what has kept you going?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
because you have woven the personal and the political and the professional, all of these so well.
Plus also sharing that belief system with a group of people in Canada, in Alberta, around the world. When you get old enough, you get over the idea that if you were only a cast of 5 million, you could change the world, right? You can be a cast of 5 people and change the world if you work in partnership with like-minded people who don't have their whole lives and personalities involved in what they're doing.
I recognize, that's right. I recognize that all my heroes were white, educated, and economically self-sufficient. Beyond that, they shared the following. They were excellent communicators, they dared to dream big, they gained skills to enable them to implement their dreams, and they all went to societal sources of power, namely politicians, to achieve important goals, and they took risks, personally and professionally. I'm going to conclude with some of the career adventures that I've had, local, national, and international. And my feminist self has guided me in these various adventures. And I think of them as adventures because it's been an exciting career for me. Some of the things that I will say are obvious to most of you. They're truisms, but they were valid for me, and I hope that they will be for you too. So a few people can make a difference. When we started that Rape Crisis Center in Ottawa, there were 3 of us. In 1985, I called 2 people with children in grade 1. Within a short time, we had the varsity after-school program up and running. It's been running now for 30 years as a varsity out-of-school program. Sky's the limit. I mention this one because in the 1990s, prior to the university having a policy, I initiated the Faculty of Social Work smoke-free policy. In 1994, I wrote an article entitled Social Work and the Development of a Smoke-Free Society. So you've got to dream big, but we're not quite there. Risk, displeasure, brickbats. I was threatened by a lawsuit for developing that particular policy. People wanted to smoke in their offices. However, I'd learned that, you really can't be hurt too much. Take a long shot. You can see that sports influenced me a lot. In the 1990s, our son was playing soccer, and we concluded on the available research that heading was not such a good part of the game. And we vigorously protested this and got laughed out of the soccer bubble. And we concluded that our opponents had already suffered brain damage. But you know what? Look at the papers every day. There's something about the concussions that kids suffer. And heading is only one factor. We recognize that, but it could be eliminated. Base your actions on research if possible. It's not always enough. We had research. So you can't always be confident that the research is going to help you. And the one example I can give here is related to a group that I was an original member of. I still am, obviously, Calgary Climate Action Network. And that was co-founded by a social worker. I've participated in various roles because it's not really my area. I'm not up on the science, and I find them difficult to present. But I've been able to make use of my public speaking and organizational skills. Thanks to leadership by people like Dr. Mishka Lysak of our faculty and social workers across North America, some of whom see themselves as ecofeminists, social work is making a contribution to this very central issue of our era. And I want to say this example suggests to me that lifespan is not necessarily the best concept to apply to our profession. I do not see social work as disappearing from the scene as individuals will. I see it as evolving, responding to threats in human well-being, and proactively pursuing problematic social conditions. We know social change can take a very long time. And the best example I can give you, and many of you are familiar with this, was the long-time engagement to change the title alderman to councillor in Calgary. That initiative was launched in 1977. I joined the fray in 1987 with a letter to the editor, and much action followed. Lobbying of local politicians, surveys of their positions, petitions, formation of a group that we called Citizens for Calgary Councillors. We made it sound really, really big. It wasn't. And in due course, we had a vote. We lost the vote in 2003. We had a second vote in 2007, which we also lost. And finally, after we got Mayor Nenshi in, we won the vote in 2010 with the starting date for 2013. So if you think that initiative took, not my own, I was only involved from 87, but from 77 to 2013. So don't give up. Social change does take a long time. It also illustrates my long-time investment in eliminating sexist language. I echo Premier Couillard of Quebec after the January mosque slaying. Words are really important. And that's why I never let myself be known as a master of ceremonies, for example. I like to host events, and I don't call anyone guys or try to avoid that. Also, my colleagues always tease me because I don't believe the word retired applies to many social workers. So find your voice. That's always been part and parcel of who I have been. And this critical skill is a frightening one at times, but it can be developed as demonstrated in workshops that we've given for many years, Jim and I, on acting assertively. It's a concept that's gone out of fashion to some extent, but the same issues are still there. Use humor, theater, and song, whatever you can take. Whatever you can use, whatever it takes. Our voices, bodies, and talents can be used creatively for purposes of social change. I've always promoted, for example, the Raging Grannies. I think they're a wonderful force, and they really make an impact. And this year was an idea that I had. We could do Christmas songs. I'm not in them, but I'd like to support them. We'd made up Christmas melodies related to supporting the carbon tax, and had great fun on the LRT and downtown on Stephen Avenue Mall. I always believe strongly in having a good time with what you're doing. And I also believe in using the media. And I'm referring in this instance to traditional media. And it's interesting, even yesterday someone, a very seasoned practitioner and an academic, said how much they didn't like using the media. And there are all kinds of reasons that people don't want to get on the media. And sometimes I fully realize people are in workplaces where they can't just be as free as I have been to state what they believe. Individuals fear they may not be able to state their viewpoint clearly, or they expect backlash from colleagues. And organizations can hesitate. Everybody wants to double-check everything, unlike Trump. I think we have almost too much anxiety about using the media. I will say that I've been treated very fairly in the press since 1972. And this past year has been one of intense media involvement for me. I've had a most profound experience in helping my friend Hannah Schaefer be the first person in Canada to get a court-ordered exemption on February 25th of last year for her assisted death. She was in that interim period when we could apply for court-ordered exemptions. It was a very difficult period. But I will say the media were extremely supportive of our journey and the roles that her partner Daniel Lauren and I played. And we have been instrumental in promoting the development of services provincially due to our readiness to make use of the media. That was why it was so important for Daniel and me to get the publication ban lifted on April 27th, 2016. It enables us to continue doing what we committed ourselves to her, that we would continue fighting for Hannah. And my engagement as a friend, because I was there as a friend, we were friends for 34 years, and it was over a 3-year period that we engaged in this particular matter. It meant seeking physicians, we couldn't find anyone except Dr. Weeb in Vancouver, finding a lawyer, finding even a funeral director who would help us. Everything seemed to be a hurdle, but we got through it, and she was able to experience the death that she wanted. We employ social media as suits your own style. This would be my advice in this regard. I respect the capacity of social media to foster change, but I've chosen not to engage in Facebook, Twitter, etc., because I think I would be overwhelmed by the urge to try to stay connected. But I've participated in various groups, such as the Mayor's Committee on Civic Engagement since its inception in 2010. And there we have people who are very expert in using the social media. I mention this because civic engagement, which I got into through that particular committee, but now it has become another special area in social work. There's a considerable following, including a journal. The concept is very congruent with our long-time focus on community development. And in this regard, I'm leaving you postcards related to the campaign, 3 Things for Canada. These kinds of postcards, they're out there at the 2 exit doors. If you take that card, you can write there on the back the 3 things you've done to support Canada. This is based on the campaign that we had, 3 Things for Calgary, which was a way of fostering civic engagement in the city of Calgary. We've expanded it now to celebrate the 150 years celebration by saying, what can we do for Canada and even internationally? There are also buttons there, so please feel free to pick those up, and you can check out the website for 3 Things for Canada. One of the issues you might want to do something about to promote, I think it's a wonderful idea. I heard recently from Kathleen Mahoney and Phil Fontaine that there is a campaign to identify Indigenous people as one of the 3 founding peoples of Canada. That's a wonderful campaign, I think, if we could get that into legislation. So you can promote that, and that could be one of your 3 things. The website for that initiative, I just learned, is Recognition to Action. You'll find it. But there are so many issues that we can get involved in that are, I think, very central to us as social workers. Risk the controversial. I could tell you about my research on interviewing women who lifted their tops on 17th Avenue in Calgary during the 2004 hockey playoffs. That raised quite a bit of controversy, I would say, as well as their tops. So there were a lot of issues that were controversial. I always believed, as did my mentors, use political allies. When we were challenging, for example, the school board's narrow definition of the family, we couldn't find political allies and had to strike out on our own. The situation in Alberta has changed wonderfully. Now we have allies in the provincial government and in particular social workers, and they want to hear from us. Isn't that wonderful? It's just a new era, and I'm so glad that I've experienced it. To have 6 social workers in the provincial government, I think, is worthy of a movie of some kind. It's also indicative, I believe, of the higher esteem that social workers in the profession have gained among the general public, and you should all be congratulated for that, because we have achieved that together, and we should continue to build on it. I leave this one as, can one intertwine the personal and professional? You know me well enough to know that, of course, we can use our personal experience as a source of inspiration and of data. I'm not suggesting that we cross some ethical boundary line that puts you in any kind of jeopardy. Indeed, that's something Jim and I spend a lot of time working on. What were those gray areas where we have to make decisions? But my involvement with assisting my friend Hannah Schaefer, I think, is an excellent example. I was there as her friend, but I learned a lot. Dr. Weeb told me the other day how much she learned. That was the first court-ordered, that was the first assisted death that she participated in. So you can really learn a great deal from the personal experiences and then transform that into an issue that becomes a social work issue. Finally, persistence pays off. No need to elaborate on this one, just hang in, don't give up. The profession provides the base for all of us to pursue a wide variety of social goals. As far as I'm concerned, there's no last act or finale for social work. I envision the profession as continuously evolving as we address new demands locally, nationally, and internationally. Because relationships are so important personally and professionally, I want to close by honoring my friend Hannah Schaefer and all of us with John Wart Henman's musical tribute to his friend Ken, who also died of ALS. I would hope that that music, that focus on relationship, on being together, on collaborating, will be your guide to a successful conference and a successful career.
Hello, my beautiful friend. I've come to see you again. And as much as I try, I can't say goodbye. When it's time to go, I'll just say hello. Hello, my beautiful friend. If you could be judged by how much you're loved and how much we've learned from the love you've returned, you must be a friend among friends. And if your worth while on this earth can be measured in part by the weight of my heart, you must be a friend among friends. Hello, my beautiful friend. I've come to see you again. And as much as I try, I can't say goodbye. When I leave to go, I'll just say hello. Hello, my beautiful friend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for such a wonderful presentation this morning. I know you had some nerves, and Mary and I have been working together for a few months on what this was going to look like, and I think it turned out wonderfully. So once again, thank you so much to you. Just a reminder, Mary mentioned a couple times the note cards that you've written on. We're going to ask folks to exit through the two doors on this side, and if you can drop those note cards you wrote on in there. There's a couple of bulletin boards just out on the side here that we're going to be posting some of that information, so check back over the next couple of days. We are having a break now, so there should be coffee out here. The workshops are going to start at 10:30, so find your way to your workshop space and have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Thanks, Mary.